Amelia Earhart set off to fly around the world and was never seen again, unless a lost photograph proves otherwise. A logger in Arizona claims he was taken aboard a UFO and returned days later, and an Australian man disappeared for 20 years, only to reappear with no memory of his past life. These are more disturbing cases of people who vanished and returned from another reality. Amelia Earhart's disappearance is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of all time. In 1937, she set off on a mission to become the first woman to fly around the world. But on July 2nd, her plane vanished somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. The last radio transmission from her reported she was running low on fuel near Howland Island, and then nothing. The massive search that followed turned up nothing, and Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea. That's the official story, but over the years, people have reported strange sightings and theories that suggest she might not have died in a crash. Some claim she was captured by the Japanese and held as a prisoner of war. Others believe she assumed a new identity and lived out her days in secrecy. Some claim to have actually spotted her with their own eyes. And in 2017, a supposed long-lost photograph surfaced from US military archives and was shared online. Some said there was a woman looking a lot like Earhart and a man who could be Noonan on a dock in the Marshall Islands. In Sydney, Australia, 1987, Gabriel Nagy went out to run errands like any normal day. He even called his wife Pamela, saying that he'd be home for lunch, but he never showed up. Pamela called the police, and soon after, a disturbing discovery was made. Gabriel's car was found burned out on the side of the road, and there was no sign of Gabriel himself. There was a massive search, but the case quickly went cold. That is, until 2 weeks later, when police discovered someone had withdrawn money from Gabriel's account over 100 miles away. But after that, the trail went dead again for 20 years. Right before Gabriel was about to be declared legally dead, one final search by a determined constable led to a shocking discovery. A man in Mackay had recently undergone surgery. His name was Ron Saunders, but hospital records showed that he also went by Gabriel Nagy. When authorities contacted him, he told them that he had barely remembered the last 2 decades. He'd been living on the streets, doing odd jobs with only fragments of memory from his past life. Doctors suspected that he'd suffered severe head trauma in the accident that burned out his car, leading to a rare case of amnesia. But something didn't quite add up. If he still knew his name, why hadn't he tried to find his family? Why not contact the police? Well, whatever the answer, the family was reunited in the end. What would you do if you realized your work could be used for something catastrophic? In the case of Italian physicist Ettore Majorana, he might have chosen to vanish. In 1938, Majorana, a brilliant scientist working on cutting-edge atomic research, boarded a ship from Palermo to Naples, but when the ship arrived, he was nowhere to be found. Witnesses confirmed that he'd gotten on the boat, but no one saw him get off. There were no reports of foul play either, and the weather had been calm. For years, people wondered if he'd been kidnapped, killed, fled into hiding. It wasn't until 2011 that a new clue finally came about. A photograph taken in Argentina in the 50s of a man who looked exactly like Majorana. Facial recognition experts found 10 points of similarity, meaning it was very likely him, but he barely looked like he'd aged. The leading theory is that Majorana, realizing his work on neutrinos could be used for nuclear weapons, deliberately disappeared. Some believe he may have even worked on early atomic research before realizing the implications and choosing to disappear and start over. But to this day, we still can't say for sure. On May 25th, 1985, police in Aurora, Colorado were called to a shopping mall about a woman in distress. She had no ID, no memory of who she was, and was carrying only an empty notepad and a car key. She was taken to a hospital where she spent 4 months trying to piece together her past, even reaching out to local news outlets for help, but nothing turned up. With no answers, she decided to start fresh. She changed her name to Jane D and moved to Alaska, where she built a whole new life, marrying, having 2 sets of twins, and settling down. 12 years passed, and that's when a co-worker of hers happened to see a news broadcast from Seattle about a missing woman named Jody Roberts. The photo was unmistakable. Jane D was Jody Roberts. an investigative journalist who had disappeared from Washington State in 1985. But what happened? How had she completely forgotten who she was? Long-term amnesia this severe is usually caused by extreme trauma or an epileptic event. Roberts had no history of epilepsy, and before vanishing, she'd emptied her bank account and taken her cats to a shelter. It looked like she'd planned to disappear, but to this day, the truth's never come out. She still goes by Jane D and is intensely private a person, not interested in speaking to the press. She has no social media. Does make you wonder though, if something happened, something to do with her journalism job that made her feel the need to get away. A man named Russ Kellett from North Yorkshire, England, came out with some pretty wild claims a few years back, and when various news sites told his story online, some people just memed the hell out of him, others were absolutely giddy. The story is pretty insane, but it is also pretty entertaining, and I'll just say, I'd love it to be real. So Kellett says that he's been taken by aliens at least 60 times. That's 60. Starting when he was just a boy. He describes waking up in a strange tunnel-like space, then finding himself on an operating table surrounded by towering Dracula-like beings who pumped a mysterious liquid into his body, supposedly turning him into a super soldier. For over 30 years, Kellett insists he's been part of an alien military force fighting against a race known as the Dragos, massive reptilian creatures with dragon-like heads. He says time moves differently in this war, with 4 hours on Earth equaling 4 years on distant planets, and that he's been battling not just in space, but here on Earth too, in places like the UK, other parts of Europe and South America. He even claims to have been transported through time, using a strange glass sphere inside a room with a chessboard patterned floor, sent to fight in conflicts across the universe. And I will just leave it at that. From a now deleted Reddit user comes an odd encounter at a gas station. Back in 2016, I was driving home late at night after visiting a friend. It was a route I knew well, just a long stretch of highway with barely any traffic at that hour. About halfway home, I noticed a gas station up ahead. The thing is, I didn't remember ever seeing one there before. It didn't look new either, it looked old, like straight out of the 80s. Flickering neon lights, a beat up old truck parked out front. It even had an old school gas pump. Well, I needed gas anyway, so I pulled in. Plus, there was just no way I wasn't checking this place out. The moment I stepped out of my car, everything felt off. Inside, there was an old man behind the counter staring at a tiny TV. I asked if they took cards, but he just shook his head. Cash only. I didn't have cash, so I turned around to leave. As soon as I made it back to my car, it struck me just how weird this situation was. An old gas station that I'd never seen before along a stretch of road I'd driven down plenty of times that apparently only took cash. I shuddered a little and then drove home and tried not to think about the experience before writing it down today. Honestly, I still don't know where I stopped that night or maybe even when. In 1975, Travis Walton and his logging crew were driving home after a long day working in the Apache Site-Greaves National Forest when they spotted something very bizarre. A glowing red light hovering over the trees. As they got closer, they saw what looked like a metallic craft suspended in midair. Most people would hit the gas and get out of there, but Walton had other ideas. Ignoring his crew's warnings, he got out of the truck and walked toward it. And that's when a beam of light shot down from the craft, knocking him off his feet, lifting him into the air. That was enough for the rest of the crew. They panicked and sped off. Guilt quickly set in though, and they decided to turn back. But when they returned a few minutes later, Walton was gone. A massive search followed, but no sign of Walton turned up for 5 days. Suddenly though, he reappeared. Confused and disoriented, he ended up telling everyone eventually that he'd been taken aboard a UFO, where he encountered strange beings that seemed to be experimenting on him. He claimed he managed to fight them off and escape deeper into the ship before waking up on the side of the road with no idea how much time had passed. The case became one of the most well-documented alien abduction stories in history, probably, especially since Walton and his crew all passed multiple polygraph tests. This next case, often referred to as the friendship case, might not fit the typical missing person story, but it's got a weird, unsettling angle that connects to the idea of people vanishing, at least temporarily, and coming back with some pretty wild stories. It's not going to go where you think it's going to go. So during a stretch of time between the 1950s and 60s, a group of people in Italy claimed that they were regularly in contact with extraterrestrial beings. They were supposedly peaceful, highly advanced, and deeply invested in guiding humanity toward a better future. According to those involved, the aliens would take them to hidden bases on Earth, sharing advanced knowledge about science and spirituality, and the importance of unity. Some claim to have spent significant time with these beings, and as if this whole thing wasn't strange enough, some believe that in the course of these interactions, a few of the humans may have gotten a little too close to their extraterrestrial friends, possibly leading to the birth of alien-human hybrids. Now, obviously, this is a pretty nutty case, no pun intended, but if this story is to be believed, we've got a situation where ordinary people vanished, at least for short periods, and were taken to who knows where. Apparently, though, they came back changed. This next story comes from another now deleted Reddit user and goes as follows. In 2019, I went on a solo hiking trip in Washington. It was a well-traveled trail, nothing dangerous. I planned to camp overnight and head back the next morning. Around 1 p.m., I set up camp in a clearing, and that's when things got weird. I noticed that the forest was silent. There were no birds to be heard, no wind, just this heavy stillness. The sky had also changed. It wasn't dark, but the light had this washed out grayish tint. I was uneasy at this point, but decided it just wasn't enough to get too freaked out about. Maybe a storm was coming. Well, then about an hour later, I heard the voices, muffled like a bad recording of human speech. I stuck my head out of my tent expecting to see someone, but the clearing was empty. Now, I must have fallen asleep soon after this because I don't remember much after that. But when I woke up, the clearing looked different. The trees seemed taller, the air was heavy. At this point, I was just freaked out and decided it was time to head home. Thing is, the trail was missing, at least I couldn't find it. I walked for hours in the direction I'd come, but I never seemed to get anywhere. It was actually getting dark now. Finally, I made it out though and reached my car. I checked the time, and that's when I lost it. Less than 2 hours had passed. This was impossible. I could have sworn I was out there for 5 hours. Well, I haven't gone down that trail since, and I never will again. In August of 1976, 4 friends set out for a camping trip in the Allagash Wilderness in Maine, hoping for some peaceful time away. But things took a strange turn when they spotted a bright light in the sky on their second night, which then quickly disappeared. 2 nights later, the same light appeared again, only this time it was much more intense. In fact, they described it looking almost like the sun. As they watched, it followed them along the water. One of the men, Charlie, tried to signal SOS using his flashlight, and that's when the light shot a beam toward him. When they returned to camp, everything felt off. The fire they'd left burning was out, and they were completely drained as if hours had passed. Days went by without any other strange sightings, but when the men got home, they began having these unsettling dreams, all of them similar and terrifying. It wasn't until 1988 that they finally sought help from UFO researcher Ray Fowler and decided to undergo hypnosis. Under hypnosis, they all recalled being abducted by aliens, terrifying creatures who performed medical exams on them and even took their skin and bodily fluids. What was most chilling was that each of their stories matched almost perfectly, and they even passed polygraph tests.
From a man disappearing mid-step in front of multiple witnesses, to a woman driving straight into a warped version of her hometown, and a college student who woke up 700 miles from where he went missing with no memory of how he got there. These are disturbing cases of people who vanished and returned from another reality. Now, this first case is very strange. In 1880, a farmer named David Lang reportedly vanished into thin air while walking across a field on his property near Gallatin, Tennessee. There were multiple witnesses, including his wife, his 2 children, and 2 visitors arriving in a horse-drawn buggy. They said Lang was mid-step when he literally just disappeared. There was no flash of light, he hadn't fallen or gone behind a tree, he was there 1 second, and then he wasn't. The group ran to where he'd been standing, expecting to find a sinkhole or some kind of trap in the ground, but the earth was solid. They searched the area for days. Neighbors joined in, but no sign of Lang was ever found. The only thing that changed was the grass where he had vanished. It turned sort of like it decayed. It turned yellow and brittle, and for years afterward, nothing would grow there. Then, months later, Lang returned. Sort of. His daughter was playing in a field looking for four-leafed clovers, and that's when she heard it. A voice that sounded a lot like her father, calling for help. It was faint, like it was coming from underground or from behind a wall. It happened more than once, but each time they checked, there was still nothing. Eventually, even the voice stopped. The story was pretty well known at the time. It showed up in the newspaper, and the names, place, and details were consistent with public records. Was it fabricated? Maybe, but everyone there that day remained adamant about what they saw. In 2006, Carol Chase McKelney was driving through Riverside County, California, on her way home from a dog show. As she passed through her old hometown of Riverside, she figured she'd take a quick detour to see the neighborhood she grew up in. It had been years since she visited, and she was curious to see how much it had changed. Except, it wasn't her town. The street names were right, the general layout looked familiar, but her childhood home was completely gone, and so were all of the houses around it. The neighborhood had totally changed, like it had been wiped out and replaced with strange, unfamiliar buildings. She went to look for her grandmother's house. Gone too. Her old school was nowhere to be found. Even the cemetery where several family members were buried didn't look the same. The graves were different, and the whole place just felt wrong, like a dream version of her hometown. Completely shook, she got out of there, and it wasn't until years later that she felt the courage to come back. But this time, everything was normal. Her grandmother's house was there, her childhood home too, the school, everything was just like it always had been. So, what happened? Carol was completely sober, not tired, not on medication. She knew what she saw and what she didn't see. She swore up and down that for a few strange hours, she stepped into some alternate version of her hometown, a place almost like hers, but not quite. In 1978, 23-year-old Stephen Kubacki was a college student studying German at Hope College in Michigan. One February afternoon, he went cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan and never came back. The next day, his skis and backpack were found near the edge of the frozen lake. There were footprints leading out onto the ice, and then nothing. Search and rescue teams looked for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. Everyone assumed the same thing, that he had fallen through the ice and died. Except, 15 months later, he showed up. Stephen woke up on a grassy hill in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, over 700 miles away from where he disappeared. He was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, with a satchel full of maps he didn't remember collecting. He had a t-shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin, which he didn't recall running, and his last memory was being on the ice. He walked to his aunt's house nearby, and from there eventually reconnected with his parents. Nobody had seen or heard from him in a year and 3 months, but all things considered, he looked healthy. He was just confused like everybody else. When asked what happened, Stephen said he had no idea. He didn't remember anything. It was like someone had hit a reset button on his brain. To this day, he still doesn't talk much about it, and after the incident, he went back to school, earned a degree, and eventually became a clinical psychologist, which is kind of wild considering he's got one of the strangest unsolved disappearance stories on record. But I guess also maybe that makes him the perfect person for the job, you know? In March of 2017, Bruno Borges, a 24-year-old psychology student from Brazil, vanished without a trace. His family had last seen him at their home in Rio Branco, and when they realized he hadn't taken his phone, wallet, or anything useful for a getaway, they went into his locked bedroom. And that is when things got really strange. The entire room had been turned into some kind of cryptic research lab. The furniture was gone, replaced with a giant statue of a 16th century philosopher who believed in infinite worlds and extraterrestrials. There were also pages and pages of handwritten text covering the walls, floor to ceiling. Over 14 books worth written in a bizarre code nobody could read. Bruno's family had no idea any of this was going on. He'd apparently been working on it in secret for months. When news about his disappearance came out, internet sleuths obsessed over his case. His encrypted writings were eventually partially decoded. They talked about personal evolution, contact with higher beings, and preparing humanity for something bigger. But still, no one knew where he went. But after 5 months of silence, Bruno showed up back home, barefoot. He wouldn't say much about where he'd been, only that he'd been working on his ideas. His family and police said he was in good health, mentally stable, and not on any substances. He didn't really give interviews, and most of the public still doesn't know why he left or what exactly he was trying to do. In 1935, British Royal Air Force officer Victor Goddard was flying a biplane over an abandoned airfield near Edinburgh, Scotland. I think that's how you say it, and everyone in the comments is gonna be like, that's not how you say it. Well, I'm not Scottish, so I don't know what you want me to do. The place was falling apart, overgrown with weeds, buildings crumbling, not a soul in sight. A few days later, he flew the same route again, but this time, something was off. As he approached the airfield, a sudden storm hit. Thick, swirling clouds, heavy rain, turbulence. Then, just as fast, the sky cleared. Everything looked brighter. Unnaturally so. The airfield below was no longer abandoned. The buildings were intact, freshly painted. Planes were on the ground, yellow ones, which wasn't the standard RAF color at the time, and mechanics in blue overalls were moving around, working on them. None of this made sense in 1935. The colors, the uniforms, the specific model of aircraft he saw, they weren't part of the Air Force yet. When he told people what he'd seen, they thought he was just confused or mistaken. But a few years later, during World War II, that same airfield was brought back to life. It was restored, the planes were painted yellow, and the mechanics wore blue coveralls, just like Goddard had described. It was as if he had seen the future. No one could explain it then, and no one really can now, and Goddard wasn't some nut. He was an air marshal. Dead serious, no nonsense, and he swore up and down till his death that this actually happened. In 2008, a woman named Lorena Garcia from Spain woke up and immediately felt something was off. At first, it was little things. Her bed sheets were different, her pajamas weren't the ones she remembered putting on the night before. Confused, she chalked it up to grogginess and just got ready for work. But when she got to the office, the weirdness escalated. She'd been working at the same place for 20 years, but when she arrived, she realized she didn't work in the same department anymore. She was listed under a completely different role, one she swore she'd never been assigned. Her boss, her coworkers, the whole structure was different, but it got worse. She reached out to her ex-boyfriend, who she'd broken up with months earlier, only to find out that they'd never broken up at all. According to him, they were still together. The man she had been dating, who she'd just seen a few days ago, was nowhere to be found. His number didn't even work. It was like he never existed. Lorena genuinely believed she'd woken up in a different version of reality, one nearly identical to her own, but with very key differences. She went to doctors, psychologists, everyone she could think of trying to explain what happened, but no one had an answer. She was healthy, her memory was sharp, yet her life didn't match her memories. And to this day, Lorena insists that she's from somewhere else, that she somehow crossed into a parallel dimension and has been stuck here ever since. In May of 1972, 4 girls from Southern Utah University were driving home after a rodeo when they took a shortcut through Gadianton Canyon, near the Utah-Nevada border. Around 10 p.m., the road beneath them changed from black asphalt to smooth white cement. The desert landscape gave way to unfamiliar grain fields and towering pines, not at all what they expected in southern Utah. Thinking they were lost, they turned around. Then they spotted a small roadside tavern and pulled over to ask for directions. Before anyone could get out, one of the girls screamed. Heading towards them were 4 strange egg-shaped vehicles vehicles with tricycle-style wheels and glowing lights. The girls, completely panicked, jumped back in the car and tore off through the canyon. As suddenly as it started, the strange scenery disappeared and the road returned to normal. They eventually crashed into a creek, damaging her car and flattening 3 tires. At dawn, they hiked to the highway and flagged down a trooper named Victoria Lindquist, who was shocked and confused to find that their tire tracks ended abruptly 600 feet into the desert. And despite being found miles from the road, no one could explain how they got there. One hubcap was also missing, which was never found. Back in the 1800s, there was a man named William Cantello, an eccentric British inventor obsessed with creating a rapid-fire automatic weapon. After years of work, he told his family he was heading to the market to sell his invention, and he never came back home. Roughly 20 years later, an American inventor named Hiram Maxim rose to fame with, you guessed it, a rapid-fire automatic firearm. Maxim also looked strikingly similar to Cantello, so much so that Cantello's own children were convinced he was their father. The resemblance became such a nuisance that Maxim addressed it in his autobiography, claiming someone had been impersonating him. Now, that may have been the case. It was just a coincidence that he not only looked just like another man, but also took up the same vocation. But some believe Cantello faked his disappearance and took on a new identity, or that Cantello and Maxim were the same person from 2 different realities, and at some point they switched places, leaving both men stuck in the wrong timeline. This has to be one of the strangest missing persons cases that I have ever heard. In 1763, in a quiet English town of Shepton Mallet, a man named Owen Parfitt vanished without a trace. He was old, frail, and paralyzed. He couldn't walk, couldn't dress himself, he barely moved. Locals say he was a former sailor with a shady past, but by the time this story takes place, he was basically bedridden. Well, one warm evening, Owen was sitting outside his sister's cottage, propped in a chair enjoying the breeze. His sister and a neighbor helped him outside, then they went inside for a bit. They claimed they were gone maybe 15 minutes, and when they came back, the chair was there, still facing the road, but Owen was gone. Now, this wasn't a busy area. It wasn't like someone could sneak up, lift a full-grown man who couldn't walk, and then vanish without making a sound, but it seemed like that's exactly what happened. People searched the fields, wells, nearby roads. Nothing. Days passed, then weeks. Rumors spread. Some started to wonder if he'd just been faking the paralysis for years before finally deciding to... what? Wander off into the wilderness alone? I don't know, it's not a good option. The theories? I don't know. I've gotten no new ones. In 1961, a girl named Terry Jo Duperalt went on what was supposed to be a dream family vacation, a week-long cruise on a rented sailboat in the Bahamas. But just a few days in, everything went horribly wrong. Terry Jo woke up one night to the sound of footsteps and her brother screaming. When she went topside, she found the deck covered in blood. Her mother and brother were dead. The captain, Julian Harvey, was the only adult left standing, and when he saw her, he didn't say a word, he just stared. She went back below deck, terrified. Minutes later, water started flooding in. The boat was sinking. She escaped onto a small floaty and drifted alone for nearly 4 days under the scorching sun. Dehydrated, sunburned, and half-conscious, she was eventually rescued by a Greek freighter. The fact that she survived at all was almost a miracle. Captain Harvey was rescued days earlier in a lifeboat and told authorities that the boat sank in a freak accident. He said that everyone else was lost at sea, but when he found out Terry Jo survived, he took his own life immediately. She never saw him kill her family, but everyone believes that that is exactly what happened, probably for insurance money. Still, there are holes in the story, and what Terry Jo saw that night, she never fully talked about. Some say she blocked it all out, others think something even darker went down. Till this day, though, the case has never really been solved. There is a book about this, if you're interested. I think it's called like Orphan Lost at Sea or something like that. And also, if you're a fan of the podcast MFM, if you know, you know, in one of their recap episodes that they're doing right now, the rewinds, they just did this one like a few weeks ago, so go listen to that, read the book. The story's crazy, you guys, that's just crazy. This little girl's just lost at sea, then she's found, and everything was okay for her. And that's the important part of the story. In our number 10 spot today, we have Hale Boggs. We have all heard of the Bermuda Triangle, but have you heard of the Alaskan Triangle? Since 1988, apparently more than 16,000 people have vanished in the Alaskan Triangle, most of them without a trace. This triangle is responsible for disappearances at twice the rate of the national average, so it only seems reasonable that we talk about at least one of those cases today, and that is the case of US House Majority Leader Hale Boggs. On October 16, 1972, Thomas Hale Boggs Jr., along with an Alaska congressman and 2 other passengers, as well as the pilot of course, were flying from Anchorage to Juneau when their flight suddenly vanished. The disappearance of the plane caused one of the country's largest search and rescue missions ever, which involved 40 military aircrafts, 50 civilian planes, and a 39-day search that expanded 32,000 square miles. Despite this, there was never any kind of sign found. No wreckage from the plane, not even debris, no human alive or otherwise was ever found. It was like they all completely vanished into thin air. Having people like this on this list is not to make light of the real people who disappeared under these kinds of mysterious circumstances, but rather to bring attention to just how strange that really is. In our number 9 spot today, we have Ambrose Bierce. This story is particularly interesting because of the fact that Ambrose wrote a story called The Unfinished Race, which was about a mysterious and seemingly impossible disappearance, only to disappear later himself. In October of 1913, Ambrose was 71 years old, and he left Washington, D.C. for a tour of his old Civil War battlefields. Little is known about what exactly happened from here, but rumor has it that he crossed the border into Mexico, which was in the midst of a revolution. It is apparently here that he witnessed the Battle of Terra Blanca. The last known communication he had with the world was a letter he wrote to a friend in which he said, "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." After this, he seemingly vanished without a trace. There are many theories as to what may have really happened here and where Ambrose actually ended up, but his true fate is still a mystery even a century later. I do think it is a very weird coincidence for him to have written about a strange disappearance only to do the same himself later in life. Maybe Ambrose knew something that we don't? In our number 8 spot today, we have Gavin. This story is a little different and it comes from a Reddit user called Theus_Eus. They start off by explaining that in school they met a friend named Gavin. They became pretty good friends over their shared love of World of Warcraft. He also explains that Gavin was a pretty socially awkward kid but was also incredibly smart with an IQ apparently around 180. After time passed, the pair became best friends who would often go over to each other's houses to play games, watch YouTube, you know, things that best friends in school do. They carry on the story to say, "One day I decided to come over to his house uninvited. I just thought we were really good friends, so it was cool. So I knocked on his door and this older looking guy opened, around 40. He had a little bit of a gray hair and a beard. Now at first I assumed this was Gavin's dad because they looked eerily similar, but then I remembered that Gavin doesn't have a dad. I then assumed that he was a relative. I asked him if Gavin was home and he laughed and told me that he's Gavin. I found this a bit weird, but it could just be a coincidence or Gavin was simply named by his uncle. I told him that I'm looking for a 16-year-old Gavin, described him to the guy, and he started looking uneasy. After some hesitation, he said Gavin was not home. I asked him when he was going to get home, didn't really go into questioning who he was, and he gave me a time after thinking for a few seconds. So then I came over at the given time and my friend 16-year-old Gavin opened the door. I told him that his relative was there. He told me that he has no relative with the same name as him, and he also told me that he was home at the time I came and met the 40-year-old. We both found this extremely weird and our only explanation is time travel. I still keep in touch with Gavin, who happens to be studying quantum mechanics. We still haven't told anyone this story. To be honest, I'm not sure if this one is a parallel universe story or a time travel story, but all I know is that something strange was definitely going on here, and that is why it had to be included on this list today. I'm just glad that the regular kid version of Gavin ended up coming back. In our number 7 spot today, we have Orion Williamson. This story takes place a while ago in July of 1854 on a farm near Selma, Alabama that belonged to Orion Williamson. Orion and his wife and child were sitting on their porch when Orion got up to go and bring the horses in from the pasture. His wife and child watched as he went out into the field, and even his neighbors on the far side of the field saw him and got a wave from him, but this was the last time he was ever seen. How could someone who is basically being watched by multiple people just vanish without a trace? Both his family and his neighbors searched the field trying to find any sign of what could have happened, or maybe a hole that he could have fallen into, but to no avail. In the days that followed, the field was covered with people and bloodhounds searching as well, but there was never any sign or trace that led to anyone being able to find out what exactly happened to Orion. Despite the time that has passed, his disappearance still remains a huge mystery with no evidence to go on. In our number 6 spot today, we have Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was an author and a pilot in the 1920s and 30s. She broke records by being the first female aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, and she also played a huge role in the formation of the 99s, which is an organization for female pilots. In 1936, Amelia started planning her around-the-world flight, and she even had an entire plane built with her specific modifications, such as additional fuel tanks. There were 2 attempts at the world flight, the first one obviously being unsuccessful, but the second was catastrophic. Amelia was flying with navigator Fred Noonan when they lost contact with anyone on the ground. What's crazy about this is that they know virtually everything that happened on that flight until those final moments when everything became a mystery. They have never been able to find the plane, or Amelia, or Fred. Some theories as to what happened are that the plane ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean and sank, where some have suggested that maybe they made it to a nearby island but were found and killed for some reason, but the truth is that no one really knows for sure. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ashmore. In 1878, Charles Ashmore was just 16 years old when he left the house on a November evening to grab some water from the well. His family rightfully became worried when he didn't return right away, and his father and sister promptly went out searching for him with a lantern to light their way. Because of the time of year, his footsteps were visible in the light layer of freshly fallen snow, but here's where things get weird. About halfway to the well, Charles' footprints just abruptly stop. There was no sign of a change of direction, a struggle, any jumping or sliding. They just stopped, as if he had simply vanished. Of course, his father and sister rushed to make sure he hadn't fallen down the well, but it was so covered in ice that there was no way. Despite their best searches, they were never able to find either Charles or any clues of what may have happened. But things get even stranger. 4 days after his disappearance, Charles' mother was out searching for him when she heard his voice calling for her. She frantically searched around, and despite hearing his voice clearly, she couldn't see him at all. From that day, more friends and family members also reported having this same sort of experience. As time went on, the calls grew fainter and fainter, as if he was calling to them from a farther distance, and eventually by summer, the calls had stopped entirely. Charles' disappearance still remains a mystery to this day. In our number 4 spot today, we have Bruce Campbell. On April 14th, 1959, Bruce Campbell was sleeping next to his wife in a motel that they were staying at. The couple was on a trip from their hometown in Massachusetts across the country to visit their son. The couple stopped at a motel in Jacksonville, Illinois, which was meant to be their only overnight stop, but unfortunately things took a very dark turn on this night. Bruce's wife awoke a few times in the middle of the night. The first time she found everything to be normal as her husband was asleep beside her, but the final time she woke up, Bruce was nowhere to be found. All of his belongings, including his wallet, his car, his clothing, aside from the bright green pajamas he had gone to bed in, it was all in the motel. The only thing missing was Bruce. Very sadly, this was the last time Bruce was ever seen, and there has since been no explanations of what happened to him and no trace that might lead to an answer. It is exceptionally strange for something like this to happen, and for all of these years to go by with no leads, no witnesses, and really nothing to go on. Hopefully one day we do get some answers as to what happened to Bruce, because it certainly is weird for a man to just vanish into thin air like that. In our number 3 spot today, we have Barbara Bollock. On July 18th, 2007, Barbara and a friend named Jim went for a hike in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Barbara was an experienced hiker and was carrying a small black bag with some essential items, as well as a pistol for safety at this time. The pair headed to an overlook to stop for a snack, and Jim stopped to look out at a scenic view for a moment with Barbara about 20 feet away from him, but when he looked back, she was gone. Not only was she an experienced hiker, but she was also familiar with the area, so it's seemingly unlikely that she would have gotten lost, not to mention the extensive search efforts that took place almost immediately after. Also, the fact that she had a weapon with her is important. While it is possible that if someone else is the cause for her disappearance and could have unarmed her, it is strange to think that she was so near to her friend and he didn't seem to hear a thing. Jim was very willing to cooperate with investigators, so he hasn't been considered a suspect throughout the investigation. There were 2 other men with dogs in the area who have not been identified, but they also aren't believed to be suspects, just possible witnesses. Barbara's husband also explained that she was afraid of heights, so she wouldn't have ventured near the precipice or off the trail. It is still unclear what exactly happened to Barbara and where she went, and for all intents and purposes, it appears as though she just simply vanished. In our number 2 spot today, we have D.B. Cooper. The classic case of D.B. Cooper is a well-known one, and one that I actually discussed in my first ever video video here on Most Amazing Top 10, but how fitting to be on this list, because what the heck happened to him and where the heck did he go? On November 24th, 1971, a man who said his name was Dan Cooper boarded a flight from Portland to Seattle. Once the plane was in the air, Cooper handed a note to the flight attendant, who dropped it into her purse without even opening it. Cooper leaned over and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb," which is probably the #1 thing on the list of the top 10 things no flight attendant ever wants to hear. After showing her the bomb, he began to list his demands, which were $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane for when they arrived. At 5:39 p.m., the aircraft landed at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. After receiving the items he had requested, Cooper ordered all the passengers and some of the flight attendants to leave the plane. The plane then took off again, and when it landed in Reno, Nevada, Cooper wasn't on it. The search for Cooper was one of the most extensive in the US history, but he has never been located, and no one knows who he really was or what happened to him after this whole ordeal. Maybe DB knew something we all don't and he vanished into another universe? If so, why did he have to hijack a plane to do so? It truly is one of our biggest mysteries that may never get solved. In our #1 spot today, we have James Tetford. James was born sometime around 1844, and while not much is known about his early life, the story I'm here to tell you today starts in the 1940s. James and his young wife Pearl were living in Fletcher in Franklin County, Vermont, and things began to get strange when James was returning home from his World War II military service. Well, actually, by the time he returned home, he found that Pearl had vanished and that their home had been left abandoned. There was no signs of where she might have gone, and no one in the family had any more information. Surprisingly, however, this is not the disappearance we are here to talk about. Just a few years later, in 1949, James was on a bus heading home from a trip where he was seeing family. There were around 14 other passengers on the bus who all confirmed seeing James aboard, as well as multiple more people who confirmed seeing him board the bus. Also, those on the bus testified to seeing him remain on the bus during the bus's second last stop before arriving at his destination. This all means that somewhere between the second last stop and the last stop, James disappeared and no one ever saw him leave the bus. All of his belongings were still on board, and he even left a local bus timetable open on his empty seat. This is another one of those disappearances that simply just don't add up. How could this possibly happen? With all of these witnesses, you'd think that someone would have seen something, right? Unfortunately, this was the last time James was ever seen or heard from. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this list, these are of course real people who disappeared, and including them on this list was not to make light of any of their disappearances, but rather to discuss the extenuating and strange circumstances that surround each one.
When James Leininger was just 2 years old, he started having violent nightmares about crashing in a plane. He'd wake up screaming about being stuck in a fire, or yelling things like "airplane crash" and "the little man can't get out." During the day, he started naming aircraft parts most toddlers wouldn't know existed, things like drop tanks and Corsairs. He also kept saying he'd flown off a ship called the Natoma and that his name had been James. His parents eventually looked into it and discovered the USS Natoma Bay was a real World War II aircraft carrier. They found a pilot on its roster named James Huston Jr. who died in combat. The plane was shot down and exploded. James the toddler also named another pilot from that crew who was still alive at the time, and when they met, the child recognized him instantly. On top of that, James could recall specific events and details of battles that matched Navy records. His parents had never really talked to him about this stuff at home, and none of it was in any children's books. As he got older, the memories started to fade, but for a while, it seemed like this kid was actually remembering a past life. At 4 years old, Shanti Devi in India started insisting that she had another family in a different town. She told her parents she wasn't really their daughter, that her real name was Lugdi Devi, and she'd lived in Mathura, about 75 miles away. She said she died giving birth to a son and gave the full name of her husband, the town he lived in, what he looked like, and even the layout of their house. At first, everyone thought she was just making things up, but when they actually looked into it, her descriptions lined up. A man named Kedar Nath lived in Mathura, had a wife named Lugdi who died during childbirth, and had a son. When Shanti met him, she instantly recognized him and greeted him like she knew him. She also correctly pointed out places and people in towns she'd supposedly never seen. Word got around and the case became so well known that a commission was set up by order of Gandhi himself. They interviewed witnesses, retraced her claims, and found that almost everything she said had a real-world match. Cameron McCulley was a regular kid growing up in Glasgow, until around age 5 when he started talking non-stop about a place called the Isle of Barra. He claimed he used to live there in a white house by the sea with a black and white dog and a family that he really missed. He talked about planes landing on the beach, his old dad named Shane Robertson, and how his old life had ended when he, quote, fell through. His parents had never even mentioned Barra before, but Cameron was convinced. Eventually they took him to the island, and it turned out there really was a white house by the sea, just like he described. But I mean, whatever, right? A white house, it's not like there aren't any other white houses in the world. Well, this one belonged to a Robertson family, again, just like young Cameron had described. Cameron was walking around like he'd been there before, naming things and pointing out details that lined up with what he'd talked about before. There were no obvious signs of how he could have known any of this. And his memories seemed emotional, not just factual. It didn't seem like he was just repeating stuff. It was as if he was genuinely grieving a life he'd left behind. In 1987, a little girl named Purnima Akanayak was born in Bakumana, Sri Lanka. She was like most kids, except for the fact that she kept talking about being crushed by a heap of iron. She'd also always tell her mother things like people who drive over others are bad, which is of course true, but it was odd that she seemed particularly focused on that specific thing, driving over someone. And when her mom got upset about a car accident that had happened one day, Purnima calmly told her not to worry because she had also died in a crash. She said a big vehicle hit her and she never made it to the hospital. Things got weirder when she started saying she used to make incense, and their name had used to be Jinadasa. She also described 2 types of incense, how she made them, and how she used to walk around with her hands behind her back, supervising workers. She also claimed she lived across the river from a temple, which was over 140 miles away from her actual home. When her family finally took her there, she started pointing out familiar places and recognized people by name. And man she used to be, who'd died in a car accident, he was real. His name was Janadasa Pereira, and he died in 1985, 2 years before Purnima was born, when a bus ran him over while he was selling incense on his bike. And to top it off, she had a birthmark exactly where Pereira's chest had been crushed. Since childhood, Jenny Cockle would have recurring dreams of being a woman named Mary Sutton who lived in Ireland, had several children, and died young in the 1930s. As she got older, Jenny became obsessed with finding out if Mary was real. She started piecing together what she remembered, names, locations, and the layout of Mary's old home. Eventually, she tracked down a town in Ireland that matched. She discovered that a woman named Mary Sutton had lived there and had died, leaving behind children. Jenny eventually reached out to them, now elderly, and met with them in person. And to their surprise, she knew all these intimate details about their lives, their personalities as kids, and even specific incidents from their childhood that had never been published or shared. One of the sons in particular became convinced that Jenny really was his mother reincarnated. He said she had the same mannerisms and emotional connection to them that Mary had. Imad Alawar was just under 2 years old when he started telling his parents about a life he had claimed to have lived in another village about 25 miles from where he was growing up in Lebanon. He gave names, described a yellow car he used to own, and spoke about specific relatives, neighbors, and his former job. His family wasn't all that worried at first, but when Imad suddenly ran to a stranger on the street one day and hugged the man as if he recognized him, and it turned out this person was actually from the town Imad had claimed he'd lived in his past life, well, this intrigued his parents. Eventually, they contacted Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who'd been studying cases of past life memories. Stevenson documented that Imad made 47 specific statements about his supposed past life. When Stevenson and the Elawar family visited the town, it turned out that 44 of those 47 statements matched up with the real-life story of a man named Ibrahim Boumsi, who died 5 years before Imad was born. Another important detail is that the child Imad would often talk about how thankful he was for being able to walk. Well, Ibrahim died around the age of 25 after spending a year in a sanatorium. He had tuberculosis and was confined to a bed during the final part of his life. Barbro Karlin was a Swedish writer and poet. When she was just 2 years old, though, she started telling her parents that she was Anne Frank. Her family wasn't religious, and she hadn't been taught anything about the Holocaust yet, but Barbeau described details of Anne Frank's life that she shouldn't have known. What the secret annex looked like, how the rooms were arranged, and the names of the people who'd lived there. When her parents finally took her to Amsterdam at age 10, she led them straight to the building without a map or a guide. Once inside, she pointed out changes that had been made to the house since she had lived there. She also seemed terrified of men in uniforms, even if they were just policemen on the street. Barbeau went on to become a well-known writer and stood by her memories well into adulthood. She said she remembered parts of her death, the fear of being taken, and a sense of injustice that followed her for years. Seme Tetsumus was born with a misshapen right ear, which his parents chalked up to a birth defect, but when he started talking, he claimed it was from being shot in the head in a past life. He'd said he'd been a man named Salim Fasli, a farmer from another village who'd been killed while working in his fields. He recognized people Salim had known, including his widow, and called her by name. He also gave names of Salim's kids and talked about private conversations and daily routines that no stranger would realistically know. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the same researcher who studied Ahmad Elawar, investigated Semi's case and found it pretty compelling. Salim had in fact been shot dead, and Semi's ear deformity was right where the bullet had entered. The way Semi talked about Salim's life was natural, like he was recalling memories instead of making things up. One of the eeriest parts was how Semi's personality was different from other kids in his village. He was more serious and cautious, traits Salim's family said matched the man that they had remembered. Chennai Chumale Wong was born in Thailand in 1967. When he was just 3 years old, he started saying he used to be a school teacher named Bua Kai. He claimed he'd been killed while riding his bicycle to work. His story got weirder when his family noticed he had two unusual birthmarks, one on the back of his head and another above his left eye. Well, Bua Kai was a real person who had died. And according to his autopsy report, the entry and exit wounds of the bullet that killed him matched up perfectly with Chennai's birthmarks. Chennai kept insisting he wanted to go home and would say the name of the village where he said he'd lived. Eventually, his grandma took him there, and without hesitation, he walked up to Buakai's old house. He correctly identified the man's parents and described items that had been in the home years earlier. He also remembered details like the name of Kai's bicycle and how he used to teach math. This case takes a turn from creepy to downright chilling. So a 3-year-old boy in Golan Heights, a region between Syria and Israel, started telling his family he'd been killed in a past life. He said he died when he was attacked with an axe and was buried in a nearby field. Elders in the community followed him to the spot, where they dug up a human skeleton with a wound in the skull, right where the boy said the axe had struck. Not only that, but the boy claimed to remember the name of his killer. When they confronted the man, he allegedly confessed. The whole thing was documented by Dr. Eli Lash, a respected physician known for his public health work. He said the boy's memories were disturbingly detailed, right down to the type of axe used.
What would you do if you saw yourself walking out the door while you were still sitting at your desk? A Reddit user named Trigger Happy Greg, which we'll talk about that later, worked night shifts at a small call center. One evening around 2 a.m., his coworker looked up and said, "Didn't you just leave?" Confused, Greg replied, "What are you talking about? I've been sitting here." The coworker swore she saw Greg walk past her office and out the front door. Same hoodie, same walk, same everything. They even checked the security camera, and sure enough, there was Greg walking out. But Greg had never left, and the security footage glitched right as he hit the parking lot. Erased, like someone never meant for him to be seen. Imagine someone who looks exactly like you calling your dog by name and walking down your street like they live your life. A woman from Oregon shared a chilling story on a paranormal Facebook group. Her neighbor knocked on her door one evening, confused, and asked, "Why didn't you say hi earlier? I saw you walking Max." Only this woman had been inside all day. Max, her golden retriever, hadn't left the house. The neighbor was adamant, said she even waved and the woman waved back. Creeped out, she checked her doorbell cam and saw someone with her exact face walking Max past the house. But conveniently, the footage froze just as the double turned to look at the camera. What if you called your own phone and someone answered. A man named Alex recounted this story about parallel universes. While looking for his missing phone, he used his partner's device to call it, and someone picked up. The voice on the other end said hello, but it was his voice. The same tone, same speech pattern. The voice said, "Don't come looking for me," and hung up. Later, Alex found his phone under the couch, completely dead. There was no missed calls, no records of an incoming call. It was as if whoever answered was using a different version of his phone. What if someone knocked at your door and you answered while you were still upstairs? This story comes from a Reddit user named Mirror Moments, who shared an experience from when she was a teenager. One afternoon, she was upstairs in her bedroom when her friend came over and rang the doorbell. Her mom wasn't home, so no one should have answered, but her friend said that someone did, and it was her. The other her opened the door, smiled, and said, "I'm busy, come back later," before shutting it quietly. The friend was so weirded out by the interaction that she texted her asking what was going on. That's when Mirror Moments ran downstairs in confusion, only to find the door still locked. Her friend was standing outside, pale and wide-eyed. She swore that it was her. The same hoodie, the same voice, the same smirk. It was her friend. She knows what her friend looks like. When they checked the security cam footage later, it glitched right at the time the door supposedly opened. No motion, no video, just static, almost like something or someone didn't want to be seen. Someone showed up at your house claiming to be you, and your family believed them. Redditor Pale Orange Sky posted that her younger sister swore she'd picked her up from school one day, drove her home, and even helped with her homework. The problem? Well, she was working a double shift that day. Her car was parked at her job, and she had proof. Time cards, and surveillance. But her sister described the car perfectly, described her outfit, described conversations they'd supposedly had. Quote, "You told me to stay away from the old tree in the backyard," her sister said. Only she'd never said that before. Or at least, not in this universe. What's up with that old tree? I want to know why the parallel universe version was so concerned about the tree. Something mysterious. You get home and the door's unlocked. Someone's in the shower. It's you. A man named James from Missouri told his story to a paranormal podcast. He came home after a weekend trip and heard the water running. He assumed his roommate was home early, but when he opened the bathroom door, he froze. Why would he open the door when he thinks his roommate is in the shower? It's a creepy roommate. Anyways. The person in the shower had his tattoo, his build, his voice. They both screamed. The other James bolted through the back door and then vanished. When he told his roommate later, the roommate casually said, "Dude, I thought you were already here. I talked to you like an hour ago." What if one day everyone acted like you weren't you? In 2016, a woman named Marissa shared an incident in a thread about identity glitches. She walked into work and nobody recognized her. Her boss claimed they'd already spoken that morning. Her coffee was already at her desk. Someone had clocked in with her badge 20 minutes earlier. She checked the security footage and saw a woman who looked exactly like her, wearing the same clothes, walking into the office and doing everything that she normally did. The footage froze as the real Marissa walked in. Her double was never seen leaving. When your reflection moves before you do, run. A man in the UK posted on a lucid dreaming subreddit that he was brushing his teeth one morning when he noticed something was off. His reflection wasn't synced. It blinked a little too early, tilted its head before he did, and then it smiled. And he hadn't smiled. He turned around and ran out of the bathroom, nearly slipping. When he went back later, everything looked normal, except for one thing. The toothpaste cap was off, but he remembered screwing it back on. I guess the reflection didn't. Someone showed up at the DMV pretending to be you. Honestly, that's not so bad. They can wait in line for me. That's totally fine. In 2019, a man named Eric from Pennsylvania went to renew his passport and was told, "We already issued it yesterday." Confused, he checked, and sure enough, someone with his name, birth date, and even address had already picked it up. He asked for the security footage and saw someone who looked exactly like him down to a scar on his cheek, but Eric had been at work, logged into his company computer at the time. He reported it, but authorities never found the imposter or the passport. That's like crazy to think that your parallel universe doppelganger could come here and steal your identity. Would it even be a crime? I mean, technically, they are you. Sorry, I'm just like really having a moment. Like, guys, let's think about that for a second. Would they be jailed if they caught them? Let's say, yeah, they caught them. Would they be jailed for trying to steal your identity, even though it technically is their identity too? I don't know. Let me know down below. What if you met your double and they acted like you were the intruder? One of the most disturbing stories comes from a woman in Australia who shared her experience on a podcast called Somewhere Else. While staying at an Airbnb, she swore she saw someone walking into the living room from the hallway. A woman with her exact face and clothes. They locked eyes, the other version of her whispered, "You're not supposed to be here," and then apparently just disappeared into thin air. She packed up and left that night. When she checked the Airbnb listing later, it had been removed. No record of the host, no record of her stay. Even her confirmation email was gone. Doppelganger stories aren't just eerie. They challenge everything we think we know about identity, time, and maybe even reality itself. Whether they're signs of a multiverse, glitches in our simulation, or something stranger entirely, one thing's for sure, these stories are more than just spooky coincidences. They're warnings.